Herself and the South Korean, what I understand of it, establishment became a little disillusioned with China's role there, and so there's been a pullback of sorts. Many of her predecessors, I would note, went through the exact same pattern as well. So there's been ups and downs. There's been disagreements over specific issues. The Goguryeo map issue, I have to remind you, the Chinese have claimed a good chunk of North Korea is historically part of China. The Chonan incident a few years ago, where the Chinese said that the evidence of the torpedo that sunk the Chonan is uncertain and unclear, and refused to have it brought before the UN Security Council, and indeed the markings on the torpedo were very clear. North Korea stamped all over it. That produced problems between Seoul and Beijing. Recently and currently we have THAAD. So there have been strains, and there's been this sort of warming, cooling dynamic. The South Koreans get kind of euphoric about China, and then they sober up a little bit. And then they get euphoric again, and they sober up a little bit, I've noticed. The Zhongguo-ru, they call it, the China fever in South Korea. There's a strong China fever there. That's why only like half of the South Korean population speak Chinese. The president speaks Chinese. There are 74,000 South Koreans in China studying Chinese. So there is clearly an attraction there, cultural attraction from South Korea towards China. Anybody who studied the Chinese tribute system would say, right. So that's the hot part, but there's a kind of sobriety too, and that brings us to North Korea finally. So how do the Chinese think about North Korea? God knows, but we all are trying to guess and figure that out. So as a China specialist, let me try and peer into the Chinese psyche on this a little bit. So kind of three general points and then a number of specific ones. So first one is, you may not believe it, North Korea has been a strategic headache for China ever since 1950. Okay, China didn't know about the invasion of the South. Stalin knew, but the Chinese didn't know. We know that now from the archives, that's clear. So they were blindsided by Kim Il-sung's invasion to begin with, and then they got caught up, well, in defending their own border, right? They didn't enter North Korea, in support of Kim Il-sung. They entered North Korea to protect their own border because MacArthur was threatening to cross that border and go to Beijing and take out the new communist regime in Beijing with nuclear weapons if necessary. So this was, from the Chinese perspective, a defensive counterattack, right? Had nothing to do, they didn't approve of, know of, and support the North Korean invasion of the South. But they obviously did cross the Yalu and got involved in the conflict as a result. But ever from then till now, I would argue North Korea has been a major strategic headache for China. It's been very provocative. Its confrontational actions and policies, from Kim Point 1.0 to 2.0, now to 3.0, are viewed with disdain in Beijing. Make no mistake about it, the Chinese do not like this regime. And they speak very derisively about DPRK autarky, what is the term for it? Juche. China's, North Korean political sycophancy with their leaders, the political system in general, which is real classic Stalinist. The Chinese, the militarized economy, the Chinese look at North Korea and they see themselves in the mirror. The 1950s China and the 1960s China. This is, I haven't said a word about nuclear weapons, right? So this is all irrespective of nuclear weapons. But they have had, 70 years of state-to-state ties, party-to-party ties, military-to-military ties, and other elements that, have kept the ties between the two countries, at least formally, on keel. So what about the specific elements of their calculus? First point to note is that halting North Korea's nuclear program and its delivery systems is not the #1 priority for China. Surprise, surprise. Which is not to say they support it, quite to the contrary. North Korea may not have such a program without Chinese support over the years. They don't want that regime to have nuclear weapons or the ability to deliver them. But it's not the highest priority. What is the highest priority? Regime survival. Their nightmare is this regime going down for a variety of reasons. #1, it's a communist regime. There are only 5 of them left on the planet, China being the biggest one, of course. China fears color revolutions, China has itself talked into a lot of conspiracy theories about regime change of them. But another communist regime collapsing right on their border wouldn't be too good for their own legitimacy. And at the end of the day, it's the Chinese Communist Party that is the #1 priority. Maintaining the Chinese Communist Party regime in power is their overriding priority. So if the North Korean regime goes down, it has real linkage, direct linkage to the legitimacy of the CCP. Secondly, we know the potential refugee outflow would be enormous. The rebuilding of a united Korean Peninsula, or at least the northern part of it, would be astronomical. You've read these studies, it's going to cost 4 or 5, 6 times what it cost West Germany to absorb the East, and so on and so forth. So China would be impacted directly by a collapsed regime. So China has tried, that's not to say they like the regime, it's just that an existing regime is better than a non-existing regime. And they have tried for decades to try and move that regime in a more Chinese direction through reform, regime reform. They have brought, I can't tell you how many, hundreds of thousands of probably North Koreans to China to see how the reform program in China has evolved over the last 30 years, trying to get the North Koreans to follow their reform lead. And the North Koreans just won't do it. So it's not just they want regime survival. My point is they want regime reform. They want to see this regime stay in power but open. Second thing they want from North Korea, a strategic buffer. The question may be, why won't they let this regime go under? Well, the second point is the strategic buffer, right? They don't want the 45,000, is it American, no, 37,000 American forces south of the 38th parallel on the peninsula at all, much less north of the 38th parallel. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier about their sensitivity to borders and wanting to create buffer zones. The Pentagon speak for this as A2AD. I see we have some friends from the Pentagon have arrived. So, they divided Korea serves their strategic purposes as a buffer. Third reason they don't want the regime to go down is because it would affect their already vibrant relationships with the South. And they're playing, that card extremely well. They, fourthly, I think, want to establish dominant external influence over the peninsula long term, as I said at the outset. They certainly, with respect to the current regime, Kim 3.0, they currently are doing their best to freeze him out. They haven't met with him, or they haven't had him to China. Xi Jinping has not met with them. They've sent a couple high-level emissaries to Pyongyang to meet with him. But every Chinese I talked to was very, very worried about this man. Not that they were so fond of his father, but they were very worried about him. So I would say those are the elements of China's calculus towards the north. Now enter nuclear weapons. So, yes, nuclear weapons are and should be, and the delivery systems too, our American and Japan's and Seoul's and the whole region's highest priority. But it's not China's. I don't want to give you the impression that Chinese don't care about this issue. They do. They don't want to, and they're willing to work within certain frameworks, six-party talks and other frameworks, to try and bring about the denuclearization of the peninsula, but it's not their priority. So their priority, just to end and to repeat, is is keeping that buffer on their periphery, strategic buffer, and keeping the regime in place, because the consequences of regime implosion are too significant. So let me just wrap up and say, okay, so what does this mean for the United States in the next administration? I think given the time, I'm going to skip over some of what I want to say, but this is issue number one on the agenda of the new administration with China and globally. This is the most existential threat out there. And not yet, it's existential to the United States. It is, in fact, to American forces in Asia. And, you know, given the development of ballistic missiles, it won't be long before, maybe already, Alaska's within range, Hawaii's within range, continental United States down the road. So this is a really serious issue, and I'm not sure. I was at a conference last weekend where the participants were saying we tried everything except unilateral use of force against these weapons. So I'm not sure what the next administration is going to do, but it's going to be sitting there on the desk of the next president at the top of the pile of the international affairs pile of papers, at least. And I hope that, well, we have to, the one thing I will say is, however the United States deals with it, multilateral approaches are preferable. I'm not saying unilateral approaches are off the table. They can never be off the table, especially when existential threats exist. But to the extent we can work with China, we got to have a real serious adult conversation with the Chinese. And we have to start bringing some pressure on China to bring pressure on North Korea. So this administration is already doing so with secondary sanctions of late. The Chinese should be made aware that there's going to be many more such secondary sanctions. We've got to squeeze them to squeeze Pyongyang, in other words, because they're not going to do it out of their own volition, in my view. So that will contribute to greater tensions in U.S.-China relations, which is the topic I was invited to talk about today. U.S.-China relations have a lot of tensions. So let's add North Korea. You know, it's already a source of tension, but it can also be a source of cooperation if we, and they find commonality in our position. So let me stop there. Be happy to take any questions you may have. And is there a commentary, Joe?
Sure.
Yeah.
Would you please be seated? Right now, Joe, first crack.
Thank you, David, for a superb presentation, not surprisingly. Let me offer not necessarily a dissent, but a supplement to your explanation of Chinese motives. It seems to me that the Chinese nuclear and missile program for the last 20 years has benefited China in very many ways strategically. It has been a major distraction and diversion of resources, diplomatic energy, and attention for the U.S. It has placed China in the position of being a responsible stakeholder, a good faith negotiating partner in the six-party talks and the rest. And every time the U.S. has a problem with China over trade or human rights or other issues, the response from people in the administration and out of the administration is, but we need China on North Korea. So we're going to have to be easy on these other issues. So, I mean, I would posit that it's worked quite well for China, and that they have never really worried about the North Korean nuclear missile program. And indeed, there's a lot of evidence that they've enabled it over the years. And I think this is a perception that you have presented today, I think, is one that has not been held in the China scholarship community for the last couple of decades. Long overdue.
Joe, thank you, Joe. Peter?
Thank you very much, David. That was as someone who always is interested in how people perceive other governments. You have the Chinese catechism down cold. I must say, I am one of my mentors is Tom Reed, and I bring this book when I go to Chinese events. This was written in 2009 by Tom Reed and J.D. Stillman. And if you go through it, China is the #1 nuclear and missile proliferator in the world. And it did so deliberately with its eyes wide open, and it has, the only question in my mind is, and I'm curious whether you think they have, the Frankenstein they created has gotten up off the bench and is walking out of the lab. The question is, where does Kim #3 or whatever go? If we don't withdraw from the peninsula and keep our alliance with South Korea strong, deploy THAAD, Aegis, and any other missile defenses we need, I think Brad Roberts is right that we have to really start thinking seriously about extended regional nuclear deterrence, which we don't have in the Korean Peninsula. We have our strategic deterrent, but that is you're escalating pretty quickly if you're going to use nuclear weapons in that respect. And we keep sending over our bombers to give that signal to Kim Jong-un, the Kim family, and also to reassure our allies. So my worry is, and I do a lot of nuclear weapons issues and a lot of nukes, missiles. I see that they did it with a con network, and they didn't seem to care much about, is it a coincidence that the con network sold nuclear weaponry to all the, what we call rogue states? So these are totalitarian, fascist type states that are certainly not allies of the United States, though Pakistan is nominally, but look what they do with respect to harboring the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They created the Taliban. Yes, they helped defeat the Russians by funneling weapons and money through, but God, look at the guy we had to go through, this guy Hekmatyar. So that the price